And welcome back to the show. Human Rights Watch is a global movement investigating and reporting on abuses happening all corners of the world. The movement has roughly 450 people of 70-plus nationalities who are country experts, lawyers, and journalists working to protect vulnerable minorities and civilians in wartime to refugees and children in need. They direct their advocacy towards governments and armed groups and businesses by pushing them to change or enforce laws, policies, and practices. They've worked on some of the world's biggest crises, such as Syria's civil war, the Rohingya crisis, the mass killings in the Philippines, COVID-19 worldwide, policing in the U.S., and refugees in Europe. And here now to join us and share their point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the Deputy Director of the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, Ida Sawyer. And Ida, good to have you here on the Social Justice Forum.
Thanks, Daren. Great to be here.
Thank you. And so when we talk about the issue of human rights as it's compared to social justice, for someone who may not be so familiar about human rights, give us a little bit of background as to how you define human rights.
So human rights are universal fundamental rights that everyone is entitled to. So there are civil and political rights, as well as economic and social and cultural rights. It's everything from the right to life, so the right not to be extrajudicially killed by police and security forces, the right to food, the right to health care, the right to free speech, the right to free assembly. So there are a whole range of rights that are included in the broader human rights.
Yeah. And when we talk about human rights from your perspective, obviously you engage in a lot of work. I gave it to you. I gave some of our viewers some of the information in the intro. But give us a little bit about human rights, and we'll start from a national and a local perspective. I know that you've done some great work in New York City, particularly in the borough of the Bronx when it comes to the Mott Haven section.
Yes, so most of my work is in Africa, but last year I was directing our crisis and conflict team. And for the first time, actually, our crisis team was deployed to work in the United States. And that was in response to the police crackdown on protests across the country that broke out after the police killing of George Floyd. And we started documenting, collecting videos and other evidence and examples of police targeting journalists, firing tear gas, firing rubber bullets, beating protesters who were peacefully out demonstrating. And we came across what happened in Mott Haven on June 4th in the Bronx. And we found that this was one of the most aggressive incidents of police cracking down on protesters who were completely peaceful. And we felt that this was an incident that really needed to be uncovered, and we needed to dig into it a bit more. And we ended up interviewing, collecting testimony from over 80 people who participated in the protest. We collected 155 videos that were filmed during the protest and really showed from every vantage point from start to finish everything that happened. And through that, we wrote a 100-page report, and we created a 12-minute video to recreate what happened. And we showed through all of that how the police basically came in, that the protesters are marching peacefully through the Mott Haven neighborhood. And then just before the 8 p.m. curfew, which was in place, the police tracked the protesters using a tactic that's known as kettling, leaving them with absolutely no way to disperse. And then they moved in and assaulted them, wielding batons, beating protesters, sometimes from the tops of cars, and they rounded them up for arrest. And we documented how over 250 people were arrested. At least 60 people had injuries from this incident. Medics were targeted, legal observers were targeted, and it was just an egregious violation of the rights of these protesters. So so that's just one example of the report we do.
Yeah, and let's go back to that incident in Mott Haven, the Bronx. Of course, you document that, and a great deal of your work is really based on investigation. You do a lot of investigative work before you bring it forth. So after the investigation, where have things gone since then?
Yeah, so we published our report, put out the video in September, and we really focused a lot of our advocacy on the mayor's office and the NYPD, but we want we want to see accountability, and our evidence showed that Terrence Monahan, who's the highest ranking uniformed officer in the NYPD, led the operation. He was present on the ground overseeing it. The police commissioner, Dermot Shea, clearly had command responsibility over this. And the next day he called this, he said that the operation in the Bronx was executed nearly flawlessly, despite all of these violations that we documented. So our message was those top officers, those most responsible, need to face accountability to show that this type of behavior is unacceptable. We haven't seen that yet. There have been the mayor deployed the Department of Investigation to carry out a report that came out late last year and confirmed many of our findings, but the recommendations, we feel, did not go nearly far enough. The mayor himself, on that same time when the report came out, he issued an apology, and he said there would be changes going forward and additional trainings, but no accountability for those most responsible for this past incident. And there now have been a number of lawsuits, including by the New York State Attorney General, filed a lawsuit against New York City, against the NYPD, Mayor de Blasio, and the top commanders. So that's now out there. And then just today, in an innovative new initiative, Bronx Defenders worked with what's now called the Mott Haven Collective. So community members who were at the protest, and they're now demanding a reparations fund to be put in place to provide reparations assistance for those who were at the protest and suffered all of these harms, but also to support the community members of the Bronx and to try to start repairing the decades of damage caused by police brutality and discrimination, which really just culminated in this latest Mott Haven crackdown on the protesters last year.
Yeah. Very quickly, before we move on to the next topic, let's talk a little bit about the recommendations. What were the recommendations and why were you not satisfied?
So as I mentioned, part of it was pushing for accountability, and we haven't seen that yet. So we're going to keep pushing. But we also, through our report, what we wanted to demonstrate was that this type of police behavior that we documented wasn't just an isolated incident. These weren't just some bad apples who were misbehaving and needed to be disciplined. This is a much bigger systemic problem with policing in New York City and really across the country, where this type of abusive behavior is condoned and exemplified by top commanders, and they act as if they're above the law and they won't be held accountable and that they're protected. So we're pushing for the systemic changes that we believe need to be made, and that includes reducing significantly the resources that are given to the police forces and moving some of those resources to invest in the real needs of communities. And we also feel that there needs to be much more to ensure independent accountability mechanisms. So it's not just the police investigating themselves, where the end goal is often really just to protect the police officers and not ensure justice for the victims.
Yeah, that's a big conversation, and we can have you back on another show to talk about that. The police actually policing the police and how effective is that? We can come back another time. I want to take it to an international perspective. I know you spend a lot of time dealing with the human rights issues in Africa. When we think about Africa, some of the things that come to mind are sex trafficking, human trafficking, the gross injustice with food insecurity out there. Walk us through and share with us a little bit about the work that you're seeing with regards to human rights in Africa.
Yeah, so lots of different issues we're working on. Some of them in many ways similar to the work we have been doing recently in the United States, and that's around security forces cracking down on peaceful protesters. And in many countries, we are seeing, unfortunately, a backsliding on democratic principles, a backsliding on rights around elections, with presidents trying to hang on to power by holding constitutional referendums and elections that are seriously flawed, and repressing, cracking down on the opposition, on youth protesters and others. We just saw that in Uganda this month, where President Museveni has now been declared the winner of his 6th term in an electoral process that was marred by severe irregularities and lots of violence. And the main opposition candidate, a youth pop singer, actually Bobby Wine, was under house arrest when the election results were announced, and just marred by a lot of repression. So that's just one example, one area of our work. We also do a lot of work in conflict settings and document abuses by armed groups and security forces, killings of civilians, sexual violence, child recruitment, burning of villages, those types of violations. Really worrying conflict now in Ethiopia that we're focused a lot of our attention on. Also abuses around terrorism attacks and counterterrorism operations, where in some cases security forces are extremely abusive in their counterterrorism operations, killing civilians just because of their ethnicity, who are accused of or suspected of collaborating with armed Islamist groups. And that really just fuels recruitment into these armed Islamic groups. We also do a lot of work around women's rights and children's rights. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we've also looked at how lockdowns have had disproportionate impact on more vulnerable communities and impacted their ability to eat and get access to their basic livelihoods. So a whole range of human rights issues that we're working on.
Yeah, impacting change, to be able to impact change. How do you feel that your organization is able to impact change by the work that you do?
So we are at work to try to bring about change. Comes from a number of different ways. So part of it is first it's based on the investigation. So we need to have good, strong evidence to back up what we're documenting. And then we always push to try to determine who was responsible, and then name names of the perpetrators, and then look at who's supporting them, who are the higher level commanders, and we push for accountability. But we can also look at who has influence over these actors. So for example, we can press for targeted sanctions to be imposed against those most responsible for serious abuses. So that can include travel bans or asset freezes. That's one way to try to influence the behavior of these actors so they aren't sanctioned and aren't subject to these types of restrictions. And then we also work with partners and work with local actors on the ground. We're seeing, a big rise in youth movements across much of Africa, where courageous youth activists are going out on the streets and demanding change, and working together with them is a really powerful way to try to hold these powerful leaders to account.
When we talk about youth activism and being engaged in the human rights struggle, talk to me. Do we see an emergence of youth? Before we know that youth have been the game changer, if you will, in many ways of turning the tide, particularly a lot of what we saw locally, Black Lives Matter, has a huge impact, a youth impact. Talk to us about the youth impact on an international scale.
Yeah, we see it around the world, and a lot of my work in Africa, we've seen the impact. I lived for 9 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there it was really the youth movements and youth activists who led the push for change. The former president, Joseph Kabila, was hanging onto power, cracking down on everyone, highly abusive, and it was really these youth activists getting out on the streets, demanding change, that forced the former president to finally hold elections. We've seen it more recently in Nigeria with the EndSARS movement, which is really led by women and youth activists, young people saying enough is enough. Police forces targeting young people and using violence against people. And they went out on the streets. Eventually their protests did lead to the government announcing that they would disband the abusive unit, the SARS unit. But the struggle is real. Those protests were met with serious repression, and the challenges are cut out for youth activists across the continent and across the world.
People want to know how they can get connected and supporting the work that you do. How can they do that?
all of our reports and information, they're online. Our website is hrw.org. We're also on Twitter, on Instagram, and we would love for people to follow us and support us. And we have offices. We have our headquarters is in New York, and offices around the world. And on our website, there are ways to get in touch with people working on different countries and different issues.
And in the near future, what can we look forward to coming out of your organization?
So we're doing now, a big report now that we're working on Ethiopia, and the conflict in Tigray, where we're documenting really serious abuses by all forces there. So that's one report that I'm working on now.
And Ida, we want to thank you for the work that you're doing with Human Rights Watch. Thank you for being a guest here on the Social Justice Forums. Listen, we've got more shows. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We're coming right back in a few.